This section is really a whistle-stop tour of some of the changes that took place and affected life between 1500 and 1750, and also the impact that these had on health. So if we start with food, it's always a really good place to start. There are some changes to agriculture in this time period. So one change is that in the 1500s, agriculture becomes much more focused on sheep farming because people have found that they can make a lot of money by selling wool in Europe. Now, this means that some people get much richer. However, it does also mean that some people lose their jobs because it's easier to look after a sheep than it is to look after a field of crops. You don't need as many people. And also sometimes lose their land because of this rise in sheep farming. And so there's also a rise in poor homeless people called vagabonds in this century. It's quite a difficult century for a lot of people, and it's quite poor. Or some people are quite poor, and there's a lot more inequality in the 1500s. Now in the 1600s, we're still seeing famine. And for example, in 1623 to 24, there are examples of people still dying because the crops are poor. However, by the 1700s, there is something called the agricultural revolution, where basically farmers get better at farming and they learn how to drain their fields and breed their animals so that they're bigger and things. And then as a result, although some people are still very, very hungry, there are far fewer deaths from starvation. By the end of this time period as well, there are more foods available. So this is because of something called the British Empire. By the 1700s, Britain owns colonies in North America, it owns colonies in the West Indies, and it's also set up something in 1608 called the East India Company that is working in India. And as well as this, there's just a lot of improvements in trade. So as a result, there are new fruits and vegetables, like peppers and tomatoes and pumpkins and chilies, and particularly potatoes. There are new drinks, so for example coffee, and apparently by 1750 there were 500 coffee houses in London, and of course there is good old tea. There's also sugar. People don't understand the impact of sugar on their teeth for a long time. In fact, in the 1500s, it was considered more attractive to have black teeth because that meant that you were richer enough to afford sugar. But sugar has a negative impact on people's health, really, as does tobacco. Although people at the time don't realise that when it is first brought in from North America and they smoke it for its health-giving qualities. Perhaps more positive is cotton. It's far easier to have hygienic clothes if they are cotton, because cotton is easier to wash and dry. However, most of these changes and most of these innovations are really only available to rich people at the time. Now, in this time period, we also see a lot in the way of changing ideas and events. Bit of a disparate list this, there's a lot of different things on it, but we will run through. One thing we see changing ideas about is the role of parliaments. Now, there is actually a civil war in England between the King, Charles here, and Parliament, represented here by Oliver Cromwell, where the King and Parliament basically go to war. Now, Parliament wins, and over the time period, really, it gradually gains more and more power and make some more laws. However, by 1700, there's only 3% of people who can vote for Parliament. So although Parliament has more power, it's only really representing the very richest 3% of the population. In terms of science, there is an event called the Renaissance, and this is especially significant with medicine, which of course has a big impact on health. Renaissance means rebirth. Now, this actually lasts from the 13th to the 17th century, so from the 1200s to the 1600s. However, the medical Renaissance, and where it impacts on ideas about medicine, really lasts within our time period. It's sort of 1500 to 1700. And in this time period, it's not so much that people work out a lot about the way the body works and what's right about medicine, because they still don't understand a lot of things. However, they do work out a lot of things that they had believed that they realise are wrong about, for example, anatomy and what makes us ill. And they also develop quite a lot in the way of new technology to research. So things like the microscope, invented by Robert Hooke in the 1760s. So they work out what they don't quite agree with, and they also develop new technology to help them research. As well as this, we have the printing press. The printing press is really important. The first one is brought to London in 1476. And what the printing press does is it gives people far more opportunities to write down and share their ideas, and far more opportunities to read other people's ideas. Before this, if you wanted to read something, it would have been copied out by hand, probably by somebody who worked for the church. So the printing press brings massive changes. Another change in this time period is something called the English Reformation. This begins in the 1530s. And it's basically where England changes from being a Roman Catholic country, where the Pope is the head of the church, to being a Protestant country, which I will write in white, with the king at the head of it. So that leads to an awful lot of changes, an awful lot of division really in the country as well, and really changes the way that people do things. Finally, there are changes really to the towns and the cities in this time period, because we do see some degree of urbanisation. And so choose a colour for this and go for this one. That means people moving from the countryside into the towns and cities. And we can see this, for example, if we look at the figures for London, in 1500, London had 100,000 people. In 1550, had 120,000. And in 1650, that had gone up to 375,000. So there's a lot of urbanisation. There's also continue to be a lot of health problems in the cities. So, whoops, that's not the right colour for smoke. London at the time is very smoky. Apparently people didn't like foreigners and used to beat them up in London at this time. It has now stone cobbled streets, which is better than dirt tracks. London is also the first town to introduce gas lighting to light the streets at night. So that's introduced in 1680. And there's also quite a lot of stray animals wandering around, particularly dogs, which is a problem because they've got parasites in their waste, which can infect people. There's also cats, but cats catch rats and mice and pests as well. So there's more coal burning, which means that the smoke is quite smelly. There's oil lamps, there's stones. They're marking out pavements at the side of roads in a lot of towns. To make it easier for the carts to go through. And they've generally introduced some changes that make the towns slightly healthier. They are still not healthy, however. Now, the impact on people's health, people at the time weren't particularly healthy. The life expectancy at the time was 41. So the average person in this time period, in 1500s, was 41 years. Not everybody died before they were 41, obviously, but it's balanced out by a very, very high infant mortality. Now, some of the diseases that could be spread at this time might be spread like typhus with body lice. So one of the diseases at the time was typhus. That was spread by body lice, and it caused fever and also headaches, as well as vomiting and diarrhea. That's an appropriate colour, but not a very visible one. I'll do it again. Diarrhea. Some diseases were spread by contaminated food and drink. Things like sewage getting into the water, or perhaps rotten meat that was still sometimes sold. So diseases like typhoid and dysentery, which attacked people and could kill them, were caused by contaminated food and drink. And again, these would lead to fever as well as diarrhea. Some diseases particularly attacked children. So there is something called scarlet fever, which caused a bright red rash. There was a disease called measles. And there was also one called diphtheria, which made horrible sort of brown skin grow at the back of the nose and throat that could sometimes choke children. So there were some really horrible childhood diseases that particularly attacked children, and particularly more likely to kill them because children have such weak immune systems. And then there are some, like for example, influenza, which was known as the sweat. And also diphtheria, again. Have I spelled? No, I missed the H out there. Diphtheria and also pneumonia were quite common at this time, and they were caused by the damp and cold. So people were prone to a number of health difficulties in this time, but over the time period there has been a lot of innovation, there is a lot of innovation, and there are a lot of changes.